Imagine this, 10 months. 300 days of ceaseless carnage. Over 700,000 casualties. A battlefield so deadly that soldiers called it the mincer. Welcome to Verdun, where the fate of nations was decided and where human endurance was tested beyond breaking point. How did an otherwise small French town on the Meuse River become the epicenter of the most brutal battle of World War I? What drove men to fight through mud, gas attacks, and unrelenting artillery fire in what seemed to be a war without end? And who really won, when victory seemed indistinguishable from defeat? Part 1, The German Plan, Operation Judgment. By 1916, World War I was locked in a brutal stalemate. The trenches stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps, with neither side able to make a decisive breakthrough. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn believed the war could only be won by breaking the French spirit. But rather than conquering territory, he planned to target French pride itself, Verdun, a fortress town deeply embedded in French history and identity. Falkenhayn's strategy wasn't about swift conquest. Instead, he aimed to draw the French into a trap. He believed that once the French committed to defending Verdun, they would pour in soldiers, exhausting themselves in a futile defense. All the Germans needed to do was hold their ground and use artillery to inflict catastrophic losses. The Germans amassed 1,200 guns along the Verdun front. They built underground bunkers for their soldiers, laying thousands of kilometers of telephone lines. Over 2 million shells were stockpiled, enough to sustain weeks of non-stop bombardment. But as the Germans prepared, the French were unaware of the impending disaster. The defenses at Verdun were shockingly thin, with key forts like Douaumont stripped of men and artillery. It was the perfect storm waiting to unfold. Part 2, The First Onslaught. On the morning of February 21, 1916, the Germans unleashed their fury. 808 artillery guns pounded French positions for 10 hours straight. 1 million shells darkened the sky, transforming the landscape into a moonscape of craters. Entire villages were wiped off the map, and forests disintegrated into tangled wood. At 4 p.m., German stormtroopers advanced. They used flamethrowers and grenades, overwhelming the first line of French trenches. For 2 days, Colonel Émile Driant and his chasseurs bravely held the line at Bois de Cours, but German numbers overwhelmed them. Driant was killed, and only a handful of his men managed to escape. By February 25, the Germans captured Fort Douaumont, the crown jewel of Verdun's defenses, without firing a single shot. The garrison had been reduced to a maintenance crew, and the Germans waltzed in unchallenged. It seemed like Verdun would fall within days. Part 3, Payan takes command. At this critical moment, General Philippe Pétain took command of the French defense. Pétain knew that holding Verdun would require more than bravery, it would require cold, calculated endurance. He issued a clear order: there will be no retreat. From now on, French troops would fight for every meter of ground, no matter the cost. Pétain implemented a rotation system known as Noria, ensuring that soldiers spent limited time on the front lines before being relieved. This kept morale from collapsing under the relentless pressure. It also meant that nearly the entire French army, 78% of all battalions, would pass through Verdun during the course of the battle. Supplies were funneled through a single narrow road, dubbed the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Day and night, trucks, ammunition, and reinforcements flowed along this lifeline, keeping Verdun in French hands. Despite the overwhelming odds, the French artillery on the west bank of the Meuse began pounding German troops, halting their advance. For the next few months, both sides launched attack after attack. Positions like Fort Vaux and Mortam Hill were captured and recaptured multiple times in brutal close-quarters combat. Part 4, The Tide Turns. By the summer of 1916, both armies were nearing exhaustion. The Germans came within 4 kilometers of the Verdun citadel, but at a terrible cost. The battle lines barely moved as the German High Command redirected troops and artillery to the Battle of the Somme, leaving Verdun vulnerable to French counterattacks. In October, Payan launched a massive counteroffensive. French forces reclaimed Fort Douaumont after a week of heavy fighting. A month later, Fort Vaux fell back into French hands as well. The tide had turned. Part 5: The Human Cost. The numbers are staggering. 714,000 casualties, almost 70,000 per month. Some soldiers described Verdun as a meat grinder, chewing up men and spitting out their remains. Rain and artillery turned the battlefield into a sea of mud, where soldiers risked drowning in shell craters. Shell shock and desertion became common. In the worst moments, men fought not for victory, but simply to survive until they could be rotated out. The landscape of Verdun was changed forever. Entire villages were obliterated, never to be rebuilt. Forests were reduced to charred wastelands. Even today, the scars of Verdun remain. Millions of unexploded shells still lie beneath the soil, a silent reminder of the horror that unfolded here. Part 6: Verduns Legacy. The Battle of Verdun became more than just a military engagement, it became a symbol of national pride and sacrifice. For France, it represented unyielding resistance. For Germany, it was a painful reminder of a flawed strategy that drained their resources and manpower. But Verdun also teaches us harsh lessons about the cost of pride and the futility of war. Was anything truly gained from 10 months of slaughter? Or was it just another grim chapter in a war that seemed determined to destroy an entire generation? Verdun was a battle no one could win, but everyone refused to lose. It stands as a reminder of both human resilience and the tragic consequences of war. The men who fought here were not just soldiers, they were symbols of endurance, courage, and sacrifice. If you found this story of Verdun powerful, hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories from history's darkest moments.